BDOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com, and I am your host, Box Ned. Firstly, I would like to give a shout out to Jerome, also known as Mr. B from Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, and he responded to a polling question that I put out here on BBOR on the post page, and I was asking you guys in the audience, what subjects do you want to hear about, because I'm trying to make the show more interactive, and he requested another episode on Neill Cream as a Jack the Ripper suspect. So as you see, this was an episode that it was requested by one of the listeners, so if you guys have any ideas for future episodes of BBOR, you can put them in the comments section down below, and I will try my best to get to all of your requested topics. But as far as Neill Cream goes, I have one episode about him in the past, which was a very general introduction to him as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And in this one, I wanted to pick up where I left off because there are two books that have been written about him. One is called A Prescription for Murder, and the other one is called The Murderous Case of Dr. Cream by Dean Job. And that's what I would like to begin with the discussions. And please stick around to the end because I want to get to some of your questions and comments from previous Ripper Wednesday episodes, so we can kind of work with like an ongoing discussion here on Black Box Online Radio. But Neill Cream was a real serial killer. He was called the Lambeth Poisoner. He operated in 3 different countries, the United States, Canada, and, of course, England. And he was born in 1850 and passed away in 1892, so he would have been 38 years old at the time of the Whitechapel murders, because Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in 1888, starting on August 31st and going to November 9th with his reign of terror. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And the August 31st to November 9th murders are referred to as the Autumn of Terror. But of course, the Whitechapel murders actually began in the spring of 1888 and go all the way to 1891. So let's hear a little bit more about Neill Cream, and I want to go straight to The Murderous Case of Dr. Cream by Dean Job, because it's going to talk about some of his previous criminal activities. He is somebody who was not only a serial killer, he was a scam artist, it appears, somewhat of a quack, but he was also a medical doctor, and this is one of the major reasons why people begin to suspect him of being Jack the Ripper. And furthermore, he is caught for his crimes, and in my first episode on Neill Cream, I talked a lot more about them, and he was caught, punished, sentenced to death for being a serial killer in England, and prior to his execution, his final words were, "I am Jack," and that's like the legend that is associated with Dr. Neill Cream. And I also have to give a shout out to Jay in the comment section, JB, who said that he actually heard a variant of the story that Neill Cream's final words were not "I am Jack," it was just "I am J," like he was saying the letter J, the sound associated with the letter J. Maybe he was trying to say something that was completely different. "I am just," and then continuing the sentence. So there are a lot of legendary things that are already associated with Dr. Neill Cream. But let's have a look at the book here, The Murderous Case of Dr. Cream. Mary Cream was only 14 when her oldest brother left home to attend medical school. She remembered fragments of his troubled life, mentions of stints as a doctor in Ontario and Chicago, his conviction for murder, when she saw him again in Quebec City in the summer of 1891. For the first time in close to 2 decades, she could scarcely believe what he had become. He was almost wild and excitable, she remembered, not in his right mind. And what this is talking about is that in 1881, Neill Cream was sent to prison in the state of Illinois in the United States for the murder of a man named Daniel Stott, whom was killed with strychnine poisoning. But he let's just say he served part of his sentence, and I will pick up with that later. Cream had arrived in Quebec City on August 2nd, shortly after his release from Joliet, Illinois. His family had immigrated from Scotland to Canada when he was 4 years old, and he settled in the capital of the province of Quebec. His father, William Cream, had managed a major timber exporting firm, amassing a fortune by the time of his death in 1887. Amassing a fortune by the time of his death in 1887. Now, this is going to be everything about Thomas Neill Cream as a Jack the Ripper suspect. This is going to be the entire foundation of the theory, because he's incarcerated in the United States from 1881 to 1891. How on earth could he have been Jack the Ripper if Jack the Ripper operated in 1888? Shouldn't he have been in the United States? Well, because his father passed away in 1887, the year before the Whitechapel murder started, he possibly had his brother pay a bribe to the governor of Illinois or to somebody in the prison system to have Thomas Neill Cream let out of prison, and they fudged the records, or they included false records in their books. So that's how he was able to get out of prison, because of this massive fortune, or let's just say the amassed fortune, as opposed to a massive one. Cream spent almost 6 weeks in the city, staying at home with his brother Daniel. Relatives began calling him Thomas Neill. He wished and decided to drop the name Cream, and a Quebec businessman named Thomas Davidson recalled that, and said on account of his unfortunate troubles, no one seemed to suspect he might have any other motive for changing his name. And on a personal note as well, one of the reasons why I did an episode about Thomas Neill Cream very early on into my journey into the world of Jack the Ripper was his name stood out to me. There's something that is just very recognizable about not only Thomas Cream, but Dr. Cream. And this is something that just caught my attention when I saw his name on a suspect list. And I did the first episode about him 2 years ago. And, it's something that's easily recognizable. And somebody who is going to develop these types of serial killer tendencies may have wanted to blend in. Now, he may have just wanted to separate himself from the troubled past. That could be true. But there is the possibility that he wanted a more indistinguishable name so he could hide in plain sight. Now, his actions, at times, were that of an unsound mind, and Daniel Cream's wife would actually recall this and write it in her journals. He would exchange countenance and appear as another man. He would be excited one moment and manic another moment, and also it seemed like he was dealing with mental derangement. So it really does seem that he was dealing with some mental health issues. And it's not only because he's convicted for murder and then he's let out of prison, and he will go on to murder again in England. He just seems like he's dealing with several different types of mood instability. On September 9th, the night before he was to sail to England, Cream wrote a will when he said to be of sound mind, and oddly named his sister-in-law Jessie Reed as his executor and sole heir. In the event of his death, she would inherit all of his property as well as anything that might be owed from the estates of his deceased parents. Did Thomas Neill Cream feel a sense of imminent doom, that he would not be returning from England? The two-paragraph will written in the neat, upright lettering that would soon be familiar with the detectives of Scotland Yards showed no insights into his motives. He left Quebec City the next morning, and on October 1st, after a 20-day voyage, he scribbled a note to Daniel, that's his brother, announcing that he had arrived in England. And it's going to be left up to the reader to determine if these events happened in 1891 or 1887. Now, he's going to get to England, and I'm going to read you the next part here because I think that this is actually somewhat telling of Dr. Cream. One day, when most of the seats were taken at a restaurant, he shared a table with another man. He introduced himself as Thomas Neill. He was educated, tastefully dressed, and well-informed and well-traveled as men go, and the other diner recalled. They shared meals many times, with Thomas Cream preferring bread and cheese, washed down with beer or gin, and eggs and other delicacies on the menu. He spoke about how much he enjoyed attending the city music halls, and he talked about money and seemed obsessed with poisons, but most of the time he talked about women. His language about them was far from tolerable or agreeable, his dining companion recalled. Cream carried around a collection of pornographic photographs, which he delighted in showing to his new friend and other diners. He was restless and fidgety, and could not stand still, even when drinking at the restaurant's bar, and he was always chewing something, gum, tobacco, or the end of a cigar. His jaws moved mechanically like a cow chewing the cud. He seemed wary of every patron and waiter who approached the table. He rarely smiled, and his laugh sounded forced and fake, as if he were the villain in a melodrama. Now, I think this is very telling about Dr. Cream's mental state, because if he had the ability to control himself at first, during the initial encounter, then it really is quite odd that he would be able to not be able to control himself later on during the further exchanges with his dining companion, as well as other people in bars and restaurants. How would he have been able to control himself the first time? Because the initial paragraphs here are making it sound like Dr. Cream is somebody who is mentally unstable, which maybe he was, but dealing with some type of psychotic episode even. They use the term manic or mania, and it doesn't seem like that's what he's experiencing right then and there. And it seems to be a certain sense of control that he has, but also he seems like somebody who is pushing boundaries. He seems like someone who is a pleasure seeker. He seems like someone who is doing unconventional things, such as distributing pornographic photos in a restaurant to people he barely knows. And also, this type of restlessness, I think, is just showing a certain amount of discomfort and someone who has tested the boundaries with the people around him to see what is acceptable, and then he is starting to exhibit destructive behaviors. And I think that this really is going to show that he knows exactly what he's doing. Mental instability, yes, there seems like there is some type of mental illness going on, but I don't think he was the type of person that would have been found not guilty by mental disease or defect for any crime that he would have been associated with. He seems like someone who was doing things to fuel the dopamine surges in his brain, fueling his own excitement, partnered with the fact that he spent, 6 to 10 years in prison. So he would be somebody who may have dealt with some type of post-traumatic stress issue when he returned first to Quebec City and then, as you heard, to England. So I'm really just noticing that there are a lot of unlikable things about Thomas Neill Cream, and I should point out that I'm not a psychologist or anything of the sort, but I do think that he was a criminal, and he was a calculating criminal. He was someone who was both calculating and pleasure-seeking at the same time, if that makes sense. Thomas Neill Cream would later claim that he had come to London to consult as an eye specialist, and one of his first shops after arrival was opening the office of a Fleet Street optician. James Aitchison diagnosed his condition as hypermetropia, or farsightedness. His eyes focused improperly, blurring his vision and causing severe headaches. Cream had been suffering from this condition since childhood. Aitchison concluded that he had needed glasses for years, and supplied him with spectacles. The more his dining companion learned about Cream, the more troubled he became. He was exceedingly vicious, and seemed to live for nothing but the gratification of his own passions. Is that not exactly what I just said? Calculating and pleasure-seeking. His tastes and habits were the most depraved of order, and he made no secret of his drug use. Cream was constantly taking pills, 2 or 3 or 4 at a time, that he said contained cocaine, morphine, as well as strychnine, a deadly poison used in minute quantities as a stimulant in medicines. And we also have to remember that even arsenic was used as a poison, but when Thomas Neill Cream is referred to as the Lambeth Poisoner, it appears that strychnine would have been his go-to. But they were also used as an aphrodisiac, and Thomas Cream seemed delighted in that. Okay, so this thing can help you, it can kill you, and it can also turn you on. Wow. The world of substances is truly, truly something. Getting narcotics and poisons in London, Cream had discovered was very easy. He called a chemist shop on Parliament Street, just around the corner from Scotland Yard's new headquarters, and identified himself as a doctor from America, visiting the city to take courses at St. Thomas Hospital. The clerk, John Kirkby, could not find the name Thomas Neill in any of the shop's register of licensed physicians. "I'm not in the habit of selling poisons to persons whose names I cannot find in the register," he would later say. Access to poisons was restricted by law, but if Cream could not prove that he was a doctor, he should have been required to produce something or someone known to the pharmacist to vouch for him. Kirkby made an exception and took this new customer at his word. He filled Cream's order for opium and strychnine several times. When Cream asked for empty gelatin capsules of a size not in general use in Britain, Kirkby helpfully tracked them down for a supplier. Doctors and druggists filled them with medicine too bitter to be taken on its own. Thomas Neill Cream did not say how he intended to use the strychnine or the hard-to-find capsules, and Kirkby didn't ask. But let's get straight to the murders that were committed by this serial killer, the Lambeth Poisoner. There was the October 13th, 1891 murder of Ellen Nellie Donworth, and she was a 19-year-old woman. Then there was also an October 20th, 1891 murder of a 27-year-old woman named Matilda Carter. Then there was the April 2nd, 1892 murder of Louise Harvey. And then there was the April 11th, 1892 murder of Alice Marsh, and actually two women were murdered in this event, Alice Marsh and Emma Shrivel. They were 21 years old and 18 years old, respectively. Okay, though, so I'm noticing one major issue that seems to be going on with this guy as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And yes, of course, you could say that, well, he was incarcerated in America. But if he did, indeed, get out of prison in 1887, according to that theory, that some way, somehow, he's out of prison, how and why did he only start committing other crimes in 1891? I mean, what exactly is the theory that he began committing the Whitechapel murders, starting with Emma Smith, then murdering Martha Tabram prior to the Autumn of Terror, then Polly Nichols, and then Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly? Then does he just consistently murder people all the way to 1891 with the murder of Francis Coles, and then switch to poisoning people and acting really weird in restaurants for some reason? Did he just what would explain this type of mental shift when he's going from viciously and savagely murdering women, sometimes mutilating them beyond recognition, and then maybe even committing other crimes like the murder of Alice Mackenzie, and then ultimately the murder of Francis Coles to culminate the Whitechapel murders? But these are all very hands-on and confrontational murders, whereas the crimes that you just heard are poisonings, and also his crimes in America and Canada were also dealt with poisonings, particularly with strychnine. And you heard some details about how he's able to obtain this. As I said, he's a con man, and I'm just seeing this enormous disconnect from the viciousness of Jack the Ripper. But there is another Jack the Ripper suspect out there that was a serial killer poisoner, and he's given some very strong consideration. And his name was Severin Klesovsky, also known as George Chapman. He changed his name to George Chapman, and he went on to become the Burrow Poisoner. And I always have to bring up this quotation where it's that different crimes can be committed for different reasons. And with Severin Klesovsky, though, he's murdering women who are close to him on more of a personal relationship level, like his wives, whereas the women that I listed off that were murdered by the Lambeth Poisoner were sex workers, the way that Jack the Ripper murdered sex workers. And unless there was some type of bizarre mental shift that happened with Thomas Neill Cream, I'm not really seeing any explanation that would make this savage murderer who would be cutting Mary Kelly apart almost beyond recognition to just switch to, oh, hey, let's look at porn in a pub, and may I have some types of gelatin capsules? Oh, yeah, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do with them. Someone who is being really sneaky, as opposed to Jack the Ripper, who was going out with a more of a direct MO. And I don't think Jack the Ripper was some type of calculating pleasure seeker. Instead, I think that Jack the Ripper was doing all of that stuff as a byproduct, calculating to a certain degree, but not exactly doing this in a pornographic way. I think that Jack the Ripper received an enormous amount of stimulation from physically attacking the victims, and I don't quite see that from Dr. Thomas Neill Cream. I'm seeing a very different type of psychopathology associated with his crimes, if I'm using the term correctly. He seems like somebody who just would simply get off from being in control of his own emotions, or just going with the flow of his own emotions. And that's really what I think is happening based on these stories that I've heard from him and that I just read to you right now. He's this guy who tests the waters with his destructive tendencies, and he recognizes that, all right, these are the limits that I can push. And this might sound a little bit far out. And I'm not even 100% convinced if I believe this stuff, but this is Freudian psychology. It's not a perfect science, and I've had a lot of doubts about Freudian psychology in the past, but there are different phases in human behavior in human life according to Freud. There's the oral phase, the anal phase, and latency. The oral phase is when babies experience a type of pleasure seeking, like receiving milk and so on. They're just only doing things that are pleasurable to them, and that's the oral fixation. Some people believe that that's what comes from. And I remember this one quotation that I read from Sigmund Freud once, when he even stated that he thought that people who were intoxicated and in the type of euphoric state from intoxication would want to experience oral sex more than intercourse because of the same pleasure-seeking things associated with the oral phase. It's like an oral phase that never went away. And the anal phase would be more about testing boundaries, which happens between infancy. Well, it happens during infancy, let's just say that, between the being a baby and being a child. During that phase of infancy, the children are pushing boundaries, they're trying to test the limits, and they're trying to see what they can get away with. And again, some people would never lose those habits. Then there's the latency phase, which is supposed to be rather mellow for some people, between the ages of 3 to 9 or even 3 to 12 with some individuals. And then there's adolescence. Okay, so with somebody like Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, I'm seeing so many aspects of the first two phases incorporated into his personality. This type of person who clearly has a certain degree of intelligence, if he can pretend to be a doctor, or if he can, he can even be a doctor. Let's say that he has the intelligence to be a doctor. He's being very deceptive about his medical science background in England, but he seems like he has the intelligence to do this profession. But secondarily, he also seemed like someone who is just purely acting for his own benefit. And it's not exactly like some of these serial killers out there, like maybe Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, where he starts out as a criminal, stealing things for drugs, and it slowly escalates to murder. And one person that I would actually include in that might even be a little bit more similar to Thomas Neill Cream would be John George Hay, the acid bath murderer, where he my assessment of him is that he was, again, a type of conman criminal who just escalated to the point where he was murdering people and dissolving their bodies in acid. His destructive tendencies escalated because of his desire to make the cons more intense and increase his own financial power and status. With Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, it just seems like he is some type of pleasure seeker who hates women, and he has this very, very intense animosity toward them. But I'm going to be completely honest with you. I have not seen or heard anything in these statements that would actually indicate that this story of him being let out of prison in 1887 was true, or that he went to prison at all. That's another variant of the story that I explored in the past, that, oh, well, he didn't actually go to prison. They they paid a look-alike to serve the prison sentence for him, and really he's still just kind of roaming about North America until he goes to England in 1887. I also do not think that there's sufficient evidence for that. So that's why Thomas Neill Cream really falls to the bottom of the barrel in terms of being a Jack the Ripper suspect. Yes, you could look at things like, well, he seems like someone who could have had the anatomical knowledge to commit the Ripper's crimes. Well, he seems like someone who does not like women and does not like sex workers. Well, he's someone who does have homicidal tendencies, and he is somebody who is just, acting out his own passions, as it's stated in the book. But all of that is insufficient if you can't directly place him in England on August 31st of 1888, and so on. But I'd love to know what you think about Dr. Thomas Neill Cream as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and the book that I've been discussing is The Murderous Case of Dr. Cream by Dean Jobb, and I stated that I wanted to make these episodes more dynamic and incorporate things from different sources and different subjects within a single Jack the Ripper episode. And one program that I've been following is Rippercast, and it's available here on YouTube, and they've actually uploaded a whole bunch of other episodes. At first they released the episodes from 2008, but now they've released even some of the older ones here on YouTube. You can find it under the name of Rippercast. And in the episode that I was listening to today, they were discussing the myths of the Jack the Ripper case. Like, why do people believe certain things about the Ripper case? It seemed to be in contradiction to the police files, the case files, and the court documents. And they started talking about a book by Robin Odell called Riperology that is trying to provide some types of explanations for that. Number one, talking about how a myth would be created. A lot of the time, people have this twofold response to the newspapers and the media at the time of Jack the Ripper. And that is that, firstly, we should use the newspaper articles from 1888 as sources, as a window into a world of the Whitechapel murders and the investigations. But the second thing that people say about the media and the newspapers is that, oh, well, they're horribly unreliable. They were just sensationalists. They're just making stuff up to sell papers, and they're trying to terrify the people of London. You must have heard some of these stories about how there's even, the headline coming out, when will the Ripper strike next? Not, will Jack the Ripper strike next? No, when will the Ripper strike next? So they're trying to do this to generate a certain amount of attention and focus on the newspapers themselves. That means that they get fluffy with the details, they misrepresent the details, or they don't even care about the specific facts that are going into the newspaper articles. Then people years later are trying to look at the newspaper articles and act like this is the perfect, authentic narrative. And I completely understand both sides of that, because when we're in the new millennium and we want to learn about Victorian England, all we have are the text, as well as, perhaps some audio recordings from people who lived long enough to produce them. But we have to go back in time through the stories of other people, through the accounts that have been written by other people. And before you're thinking, well, you don't need the newspaper articles, you just need the case files. And I have to turn to the Citizen Detective podcast. When I was listening to the panelist Cloyd Steiger, who was a former homicide detective, he wrote the book Homicide: The View from Inside the Yellow Tape, and he made a statement that, as a homicide detective, he was once working a case, and he read an article in the newspaper about the case that he was working, and he's just shocked. He's like, not a single fact was right. It's almost like they're just talking about a different case, and they inserted the names of the people that were involved in my case and just put them into the article. So newspaper articles can get things wrong, but there's another statement. Sometimes even the case file can contain inaccurate information. And every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer here on Black Box Online Radio, and that one shows, the Zodiac Killer mystery shows us about all of the inconsistencies that we're going to find in the case file, and I'm going to be discussing a lot of that on a future episode of Zodiac Monday, so please stay tuned to that. If you're curious about that mystery, I invite you to listen to it. And ultimately, I completely agree with that. Humans are not perfect. Newspaper articles, history books, police documents, they're not always going to be accurate. But then somebody is going to read a false statement in a newspaper article, then they are going to put it in their memoirs, and then they are going to the memoir is going to be a source for writers maybe 30 years later, 40 years later, 100 years later. And one very big example of this that was discussed on the Rippercast was Walter Dew when he wrote his memoir, I Caught Crippen. And Walter Dew, of course, made a lot of comments and observations about the Jack the Ripper case, an inspector in the world of the Whitechapel murders, and perhaps the most famous person to claim that Emma Smith was a victim of Jack the Ripper as opposed to being an unrelated crime. And they're saying that, yes, he wrote this memoir, but a lot of it appears to be based on his own recollections. This is how he remembers it. And then so many people would turn to his memoir as just a type of gospel, and then they're going to start taking the statements that he said, even though it's just based on memories that he had maybe 30, 40, 50 years later. When did he write that? Just going off of memory, was it 1936 or something? Years after the Dr. Crippen case, even in the earlier part of the 20th century. So these sources are unreliable, and that makes it very difficult for us. But I would love to kind of cross-reference certain things. And also, this is one thing that I did learn from investigating other true crime cases here on Black Box Online Radio. You can read Statement A, you can read Statement B, and you can read Statement C, and you're like, well, hey, there are 3 contradictory statements about a true crime case. Oh, well, I'm going to look at the entirety of the body of literature. I'm going to look at many sources as I can. And sometimes you eliminate Statement A because you're like, that just doesn't fit. There's a contradictory piece of evidence that rules out Statement A. And then with Statement B, you're like, I guess it could work. But then you're with Statement C, and you're like, aha, this one fits like a glove. Yes, people are saying different things, but sometimes you have the ability, based on your own deductive powers, to realize that this is most likely the most accurate thing that happened to the best of our knowledge and abilities. And right now I would like to switch gears because I also want to include comments from the audience into these episodes. And I received another very interesting email from Dr. Chad, who sent this to the email address blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And he sent me a very good one in the past about the murder of Catherine Eddowes. And this one is about the murder of Mary Kelly, which was a recent subject discussed here on Black Box Online Radio. And it states, just wanted to comment on last week's Ripper Wednesday. One topic that was discussed was if the Whitechapel murderer engaged socially with the victims to put them at ease, or hid in the shadows and sprung on them, or in the case of Mary Kelly, broke into her apartment while she was sleeping. I think the preponderance of the evidence clearly suggests that the killer socially engaged with his victims, except Polly Nichols. Every other victim from Tabram to Kelly was seen in the company of a man shortly before the murder. For Martha Tabram, we have Pearlie Paul's story of soldiers. Elizabeth Long saw a man with Annie Chapman outside of 29 Hanbury Street. Elizabeth Stride was seen with multiple men on the night of the murder, as was Mary Kelly, and Catherine Eddowes was seen by 3 witnesses with a man who had the appearance of a sailor outside of Mitre Square moments before the murders. There are, of course, all sorts of problems with the eyewitness accounts, and Pearlie Paul could be lying, as could the other witness, George Hutchinson. Matthew Packer also claimed to sell grapes to Stride and a man, and also isn't reliable. If we exclude these, we have the eyewitnesses for Chapman and Eddowes in the cases that put a man and with the victims moments before their murders, and these are 2 cases that almost everyone agrees were committed by the same hand. In the case of Stride, we have the testimony of P.C. Smith, who saw her shortly before the murder on Burner Street with a man carrying a parcel wrapped in a newspaper, and Mary Cox saw Mary Kelly take a blotchy-faced man into her room on the night of the murder. It's possible that none of these witnesses saw Jack the Ripper, and that he was waiting in the shadows for the women to be alone and pounced on them when he had the opportunity, but I find it far more likely that at least one of the witnesses saw the killer. Now, I don't necessarily think that the killer was a smooth operator who was chatting up these ladies. In fact, they might have approached him, but I do believe these murders were preceded by some sort of negotiation over sex work. Great show as always, and thank you so much, Dr. Chad. And Dr. Chad, of course, has even taught classes on Jack the Ripper in the past. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you guys, and this is going to continue with some of my statements from previous Ripper Wednesdays. I perhaps was a little bit led astray, and on on last week's episode, I even made the bold statement that I thought that my thinking was contaminated by Pat Brown, the criminal profiler, and her observations on Jack the Ripper, where, firstly, she provided these explanations about how she thought that Jack the Ripper did not talk to the victims prior to the murders, and that he is just pouncing on them when the opportunity arose, as Dr. Chad put it, and she believes that Mary Kelly was not a victim of Jack the Ripper, and that was a copycat, so that's how she provides the explanation. And I also wanted to say that there's one more contaminant in my thinking that made me sort of believe that maybe Jack the Ripper is just lurking in the shadows, and it's because so many people try to discredit the Jack the Ripper suspect, Aaron Cosminsky. If you look at Thomas Neill Cream, he's a bottom-of-the-barrel suspect. We're talking like 1 out of 10 chance. With somebody like Aaron Cosminsky, I think that he's a much stronger suspect. Some agree, some disagree. I think he's a high-ranking Jack the Ripper suspect. I'll even say it now. Aaron Cosminsky may have been the real Jack the Ripper. But as far as Cosminsky's suspect profile goes, so many people point to the fact that, oh, well, Cosminsky developed this phobia of bathing and he ate food out of the gutter. And, well, why on earth would any of the women approach him the way that Dr. Chad was proposing? And also, why on earth would they even let him get near them if he was approaching them and having any type of negotiation over sex work? If he is so dirty that he never bathes and just is eating food off of the street. But, we always have to remember that the Aaron Cosminsky of 1888 may not have been the Aaron Cosminsky of 1891 when he went into the asylum. But I'm hearing all of these challenges to Cosminsky as a suspect over and over again, and it's the same reason, the phobia of bathing and the unclean habits. And I was like, well, now wait a second, how do we know that Jack the Ripper even talked to the women before the murders? Could he not have just been hiding in the shadows? Could that just not be the explanation for everything? So I had these two types of persuading factors that may have pushed me in the wrong direction, because when you actually lay out all of the 5 canonical crimes, yes, it does make more sense that there was some type of negotiation for sex work. And, I mean, I don't really think any of the claims against Kosminski rule him out, or they say that he's the absolute wrong type of suspect for the reasons that I've provided. So sometimes we can be misled. Sometimes we can also even just develop these types of emotional defenses. Well, wait a second, how do we really know that? What if it's this alternative? And we can be led astray for a period of time. But not only Dr. Chad, but multiple people who listen to this program have brought that to my attention, that they think that it's much more plausible that Jack the Ripper was talking to the victims before he was murdering them. And ultimately, about the concept of somebody breaking into Mary Kelly's room, well, if you think that Jack the Ripper did not talk to the victims before the murders, one explanation that was proposed in the book I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter is that Jack the Ripper was stalking Mary Kelly, chose her because of his physical appearance, and that he broke into her room by pushing some rags and towels that were blocking the window pane that was missing, and was able to open the window that way and killed Mary Kelly in her sleep. All right? Now, to be clear, I don't believe that. I never believe that. I mean, I'm just thrown with something like that and just saying, well, how do you know that? All right, I understand how you're arranging that in a sequence of behaviors, but, I mean, again, I was just like, that's something that's written in a novel about Jack the Ripper. I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's an interesting way to recreate the murder of Mary Kelly and how and why Jack the Ripper was able to enter her bedroom, but that is one that I do not defend, because if we're going to ask the question, what really happened, yes, it would be much more plausible and less assumptive to just say that Jack the Ripper entered Mary Kelly's room through the door, because then you'd have to be like, well, he put the rags and towels and newspapers in the hole in the window pane and also placed a jacket above to act as a type of curtain, so that he's just like trying to do all of these recreations and even throwing wood on the fire while he's at it. And I think that that's a little bit more assumptive than him going through the front door. But what would you think? You guys can give anything you want in the comments section, challenge me on any of this stuff, and some people have. And as you see, I'm very receptive to some challenges, and I'm like, wait a second, no, no, no. I've been thinking about this in the wrong way for quite some time. And also, sometimes conjecture and speculation can get the best of us. But if that's the case, let's keep the discussions going and let's actually try to get some clarity, as I just said, about being presented with multiple possibilities and finding reasons to eliminate certain possibilities. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, and BlackBoxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram. And I release shorts Monday through Friday on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, all of the platforms that I just mentioned. And you guys may have noticed that on recent episodes, I've been talking a lot about Jack the Ripper books. Last year, I had the opportunity to read several different Jack the Ripper books, numerous ones actually, and I decided to make some short episodes for the YouTube series, and all of these will be included into a larger project that I'm working on now that will be released on YouTube. And if you want to support all of the efforts for Black Box Online Radio, you can go to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday, and of course, free downloads on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts. And until next time.